Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Chandler DuPont, and I am the marketing manager at Providence. First, thank you, of course, for joining us. We understand that your time is valuable, and we appreciate the opportunity to grab your attention during your busy workday. As you may know, Providence's goal is to bring environmental expertise to our clients and stakeholders. So, to reinforce that objective, we periodically offer webinars like this one today on compliance topics that are at the forefront of industries we serve and on the minds of our clients we support. Today's webinar was planned to feature two of our surface water quality experts, Ms. Molly McKean and Ms. Hannah Orgeron. But due to unforeseen illness, Molly will not be presenting the information today, but Hannah will host our discussion, and we're going to go over, review the CWA Hazardous Substance Plan Final Rule, which will include a breakdown of the rule applicability and an overview of the EPA's substantial harm criteria. We hope this information is valuable to you and will help guide informed decisions about regulatory compliance and operations at your facility. Molly will be monitoring the Q&A and offer guidance and answers as she is able. And we also have our Water Quality Director, Yvonne Baker, monitoring questions as well. A couple tips and reminders before we get started. This webinar will be recorded and posted to our website, so feel free to watch the recording at any time. We also have some previous webinars posted under our resources page that touch on other compliance topics if that's of interest. Also, we recognize that some of you may have received an email regarding the HAN rule change webinar. That was an error, and of course, we apologize. If you joined us today for HAN information, please email marketing@providenceeng.com so we can answer any specific questions or direct you to a couple helpful resources for that. For any technical issues, you can email marketing@providenceeng.com, or you can send me a message in the chat. We anticipate starting the Q&A session around 1:30, so feel free to type in any questions using that Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We'll do our best to get to all of them. So first, I wanted to start off with some introductions. First up is Hannah Orgeron. Hannah is an experienced environmental scientist with permitting and regulatory compliance project experience that includes NPDES and state water permitting, SWIP development, SPC and SPCC plans, sampling, analysis plans, and DMRs. Hannah is also experienced in hazardous waste regulations and DOTD hazmat, which includes managing hazardous waste programs for 5 large quantity generators and 2 small quantity generator sites. She previously provided expert level compliance support for Kinder Morgan and was considered a subject matter expert for on-site management of hazardous waste and reporting across business units. And then, of course, Molly McKean, she is our senior project manager. Molly is an experienced environmental professional in the field of water regulations involving CWA and NPDES regulatory compliance. She has assisted with regulatory and technical issues across a broad spectrum of industrial classes and has prepared SPC, SPCC plans, emergency response plans, facility response plans, integrated contingency plans, in addition to NPDES permit applications, sampling and analysis plans, SWIPs, and discharge monitoring report forms. She has developed water quality and technology-based effluent limitations, implemented TMDL allocations, and responded to public and third-party comments. She's also been involved in water quality surveys and effluent modeling projects. She has completed the EPA certification for quality projects and program management, and she is also a member of the Spill Control Association of America. So with all that being said, I'm going to turn the floor over to Hannah to get us started today.
Hi, everyone. So we're going to go over the slides for the Clean Water Act Hazardous Substance Facility Response Plans. We have already met the team, so I'll just skip over this slide. So the EPA issued a final rule requiring certain facilities to develop facility response plans for worst-case discharges of Clean Water Act hazardous substances on March 14, 2024. The EPA defines a worst-case discharge as the largest foreseeable discharge in adverse weather conditions, including extreme weather conditions due to climate change. The rule applies to facilities that could potentially cause substantial harm to the environment through a discharge of a Clean Water Act hazardous substance. So just a general overview, we're going to look at rule history and applicability, substantial harm certification forms and criteria, facility response planning, submittals, and the next steps. So the rule history, EPA promulgated regulations for facility response plans for worst case discharges of oil under 40 CFR Part 112, Subpart D in 1994. Section 311J5 of the Clean Water Act directs a facility to prepare and submit a plan for responding to the maximum extent practical to a worst case discharge and to a substantial threat of a discharge of oil or a hazardous substance. In 2019, a lawsuit was filed alleging that the EPA had violated the Clean Water Act by failing to promulgate regulations requiring facility response plans for worst case discharges of Clean Water Act hazardous substances. The plaintiffs requested an order from the court to compel EPA to promulgate Clean Water Act hazardous substance worst case discharge planning regulations. Because of this, a 2020 consent decree required EPA to issue a proposed rulemaking action within 2 years and promulgate a final action within 30 months after the proposal. So this is just an overview of vessel and facility response plans and the history of it. It started in 1990 with the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. There was a presidential delegation, which was Executive Order 12777, which branched it off into agency jurisdictions. So offshore facilities are regulated under BSEE. Marine transportation related facilities and vessels fall under the U.S. Coast Guard. Onshore facilities fall under the EPA, and railroads and pipelines fall under PHMSA. So rule applicability. Facilities affected by the new rule may be identified through a self-identification process, or the EPA may assess facilities on a case-by-case basis. So there's some self-identification process screening criteria. The maximum on-site quantity of a Clean Water Act hazardous substance listed at 40 CFR 116.4 meets or exceeds 1,000 times the reportable quantity or threshold amount, and is located within a half mile of a navigable water or a conveyance to a navigable water. You must include the entire amount of a Clean Water Act substance present at the facility in aggregate, regardless of the container size or capacity. This includes systems, interconnected piping and containers, and rail cars and other mobile containers not under active shipping papers. Mixtures must be evaluated per the mixture rule to determine the amount of Clean Water Act substance present, and there are no de minimis quantities. There are certain exemptions. Regulated underground storage tanks are exempt. Articles, which are manufactured items formed to a specific shape or design during manufacture that has an in-use function dependent upon the shape or design and does not release or otherwise result in exposure to a Clean Water Act hazardous substance under normal conditions of processing and use. Uses, which are substances in use for structural components of the facility, janitorial maintenance, or employee food, drugs, cosmetics, and other personal items. In process are non-contact cooling water drawn from environment or municipal sources, MPDES permitted discharges, use of Clean Water Act hazardous substances present in either air used as compressed air or as part of combustion. Retail and personal uses are exempt, and RCRA hazardous waste is exempt. So substantial harm criteria. EPA developed criteria to determine the potential to cause substantial harm to a downstream sensitive environment in the event of a worst case discharge of a Clean Water Act hazardous substance. If screening criteria are met, the next step is evaluation of the 4 substantial harm criteria. If any of the 4 substantial harm criteria are met, an FRP is required. Evaluation of substantial harm criteria determines the potential for the worst case discharge or aqueous form of the worst case discharge to cause injury to sensitive environments located within the calculated planning distance. So there's some important definitions that we need to look at. Adverse weather means weather conditions that make it difficult for response equipment and personnel to clean up or respond to discharge Clean Water Act hazardous substances, accounting for impacts due to climate change, such as the increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, temperature fluctuations, rising seas, storm surges, inland and coastal flooding, droughts, wildfires, and permafrost melt in northern areas that must be considered when identifying response systems and equipment and a response plan for the applicable operating environment. Injury means a measurable adverse change, either long or short term, in the chemical or physical quality or the viability of a natural resource or public receptor, resulting either directly or indirectly from exposure to a discharge or exposure to a product of reactions resulting from a discharge. So the certification form. If screening criteria are met, a substantial harm certification form is required to document the evaluation of the substantial harm criteria. The form must include all calculations and documentation supporting the evaluation of the criteria and potential receptors that could be impacted by a Clean Water Act hazardous substance release. This must be recertified and resubmitted every 5 years or within 60 days of a change that impacts the potential to cause substantial harm. Planning distances. For each Clean Water Act hazardous substance above a threshold, facilities must calculate distances to endpoints based on overland and water transport factors identified in the rule and properties of the substance released. Distances are calculated by modeling fate and transport following a worst-case discharge. While the rule identifies natural disasters and potential extreme weather situations as worst-case discharge scenarios to consider, modeling may need to include various flow conditions to evaluate arrival time, concentration, and duration of exposure from a potential discharge to a sensitive area to be able to determine the potential for injury. And some discharges in low flow conditions may result in higher peak concentrations and greater potential for injury than discharges during large storm events with high flow conditions. So the substantial harm criteria. Reportable discharge history. Facilities with a reportable quantity discharge to waters of the state or adjacent shorelines within the past 5 years are considered a substantial harm facility. You have to look at the ability to adversely impact a public water system. The EPA has established 5 criteria: a violation of a national or state drinking water standard, compromising the ability to produce water compliant with a national or state drinking water standard, health impacts to users exposed to a maximum concentration in a system, contaminating the public water system infrastructure to a degree that requires remediation, and impairing taste, odor, or other aesthetic characteristics of the water. Public receptors. Parks, recreational areas, docks, and other public spaces inhabited, occupied, or used by the public. The concentration results are compared to the parameters and toxic endpoints identified in the rule to determine the potential for injury to public receptors. And fish, wildlife, and sensitive environments. Once the planning distance calculations are completed, the concentration results are compared to the parameters and toxic endpoints identified in the rule to determine the potential for injury to fish, wildlife, and sensitive environments identified in the area contingency plan. Facility response planning. If the screening criteria and one or more substantial harm criteria are met, a facility must prepare a facility response plan. For each Clean Water Act hazardous substance of concern, develop a worst-case discharge scenario with detailed hazard analysis and documentation of adequate containment measures. Identify response personnel, equipment, and actions. Include a personnel training program, plan drill and exercise programs, and facility self-inspection protocols. Facilities are required to coordinate with local emergency planning committees at least annually. So worst case discharge. For each Clean Water Act hazardous substance above a threshold, facilities must develop a worst case discharge scenario. Quantity is the maximum amount in a single container or in multiple interconnected containers. The planning distance must consider overland transport, in-water transport, adverse weather conditions, properties of the Clean Water Act hazardous substance, and no credits or consideration for existing secondary containment structures or other passive measures in place to prevent discharges. In water transport, this includes the direction of flow at point of entry and water body conditions, point of entry to navigable waters, whether it's surface or underwater, and the flow rate and duration of the discharge. Adverse weather conditions include winds, currents, river stages, and ranges of seasons and weather conditions. Clean Water Act hazardous substance properties. We have to consider the solubility and speciation in water, density, polarity, vapor pressure, and flammability, reactivity with water and common solutes in natural water bodies, and its toxicity. So what if the Clean Water Act hazardous substance releases as a gas? If there are no realistic means for a substance to enter waters of the state, planning distance essentially becomes zero. You still must consider effects of adverse weather. Soluble gas reaches a waterway in stormwater and becomes acid rain, for example. Hazard evaluation is condensed to reflect inability to reach navigable waters. An expectation is that abbreviated screening criteria will be submitted. So these are some common questions we've been getting from clients. What is the compliance deadline? So all existing facilities must prepare and submit a substantial harm criteria, a certification form, by June 1st, 2027. Facilities meeting the substantial harm determination must submit a facility response plan by June 1st, 2027. New facilities must submit a substantial harm certification within 60 days of triggering the rule and then submit the FRP within 6 months. What are facilities doing now? We're advising facilities to begin inventory of Clean Water Act hazardous substances and determining which are above the regulatory threshold, review exemptions, and hold for further guidance. The EPA is going to issue a guidance document with more details on modeling to endpoint requirements. It's important to note that the rule is unfunded until late 2025, so there is no money to develop planning tools or to issue corrections and clarifications to the rule. Some other important concerns: PrEP guidance. EPA is coordinating a PrEP update plan for late 2025. Spill response organizations must identify necessary equipment. There is no U.S. Coast Guard oversight program. Firefighting capabilities are the responsibility of the operator, cannot rely on local fire departments. If no resources are on site, companies must secure third-party contracted support. QIs must have incident command level HAZWOPER training. Some next steps: interpreting and implementing new regulations can be challenging. Although the rule and guidance are subject to change, start reviewing operations early. Providence has experience with regulatory analysis and response planning and can help with early evaluation and potential implementation of the new regulations. And now we will open up to any questions.
Thank you, Hannah. We appreciate it. So yeah, if anyone on the call has any questions, please use that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to them as soon as we can. Thank you.
So it doesn't look like we have a lot of questions right now. Thanks, Hannah, for stepping in for me. This is Molly McKean. Just as a closing note, as Hannah pointed out, the rule is not funded until later this year. EPA has said they're working on developing a guidance document. They're also potentially working on a model for this modeling to endpoint distance calculation. As you know, with the current administration, some of that may be in flux as well. So we are waiting for more guidance from EPA before jumping off into the deep end, so to speak. We do feel that it would be really beneficial to our facilities to get a good handle on what CWA hazardous substances are over that 1,000 times the RQ limit, so we can get an idea of what planning looks like. Excuse me. From a response plan perspective, a lot of facilities, you potentially have a lot of the response information in your EAPs and other response plans that you have on site, things related to RMP. The big piece that's missing under this regulation would be the that water quality analysis and modeling to endpoint to determine which receptors can potentially be impacted as a material moves through the water system. So just to close that out with a note, and as we get more information, we will keep you guys updated. Thank you.
So it looks like Barry messaged me and he said he had a question, but it was too long to type. So Barry, I'm going to unmute you and allow you to ask your question.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
First, I apologize for being late. I thought it was 1:30 and it was 1. So if I missed something that answered this question already, my apologies in advance. But it's related to applicability, and in particular mixtures that might otherwise meet the definition of oil. And for the sake of discussion, I'll give you a very specific example. We have a hard cut stream that's about 20 or 25% benzene that would easily push me over the threshold. But the remainder of that product is naphtha-based refined intermediate, if you will. So, originally I thought that I had read that if something was met the definition of otherwise oil, it would be regulated under the existing OPA 90 regs, that it was out of this one, but I'm unclear of that.
That is correct. We've been in a couple of meetings with EPA headquarters, and they've been very clear that if a substance is considered oil, they are going to continue to regulate it under 40 CFR 112. Chemicals that would be, so anything that's not oil is what they're looking to capture in this rule, essentially.
Okay, so second part of that, somewhat related, but not really, but it goes to applicability, is H2S is obviously on the list, but how's that going to work?
I have a feeling their guidance in the meeting so far is that we're to reach out to the regions if there's a question, and the region is going to make the determination. So I feel like we would be presenting some cases to Region 6 to get further guidance on issues like that.
But I mean, H2S is not a regional issue. It's ubiquitous in the refining industry. So,
right. I mean, and I guess that's kind of one of those things where a lot of questions have been presented to EPA, which their main response is that we're developing a guidance document. And so as we wait for that additional guidance, we're kind of treading water right now, waiting for some of those things to come down, because it's a very big undertaking, obviously. And a lot of, EPA has never regulated this in the past because their feeling was that these were adequately regulated under RCRA and RMP and things like that. The court didn't agree.
All right, last question and I'll hush. Last time I looked, there was no model yet. Has EPA made any progress on the applicable model?
And they have not. Unfortunately, the rule is not technically funded until later this year. Our discussions with them is that they were waiting for that funding to develop guidance and as well as work on the particular model that they wanted. My understanding is none of that is nothing has been published yet or released by EPA. And as you can imagine, we're not sure what exactly is going to happen with that funding. I see Elizabeth Bastion had a question that says, since the funding is delayed, will the effective date change?
Well,
We
yeah, I had the
haven't.
same question. I mean, the funding that's one thing, but the clock's ticking.
Yes, exactly. So we haven't heard anything from EPA on that either. There were some potential rumblings on inside EPA where rules that were not yet effective were potentially going back out for public notice. We haven't heard anything definitive on that yet either. So, and Barry, since you just joined, our guidance to clients right now is, like I said, really just to get a good handle on what substances you have that could potentially trigger the rule and hold, because we don't know what model EPA is expecting. There are several out there that we could use, but we don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot by sending something and then they come out and say, well, this is the model we need you to use.
But no, I get it. But I mean, that therein lies the lack of guidance. I mean,
Yeah,
I've already
no,
done that, but when I don't have an answer on H2S, which may very well be the thing that pushes me in or out, I don't know whether to start circling my wagons and getting ready or not, because I don't have guidance on applicability.
I agree. And everyone is really in the same boat at this point. We can put out some feelers on H2S and see what I hear. But like I said, a lot of what the region and headquarters is getting back right now is to wait for the guidance document. And like you said, time is ticking. I do think that a lot of the parts required in the response plan are things that facilities already have developed under other programs. And it will just be
Well, I
pulling
mean,
the pieces
and this
together.
is
So,
just for discussion purposes because you seem to interact with the agencies, so you might give them some feedback. You say that, and that's true. Some of the programs we have from the health and safety side and from the oversight are applicable, but the response characteristics of me or the response effort for me responding to HF dissolved in water is vastly different than any response equipment that a facility may otherwise have.
I agree.
So, I
And
mean, it is, I wouldn't downplay the fact that it's just going to be a slight modification of the things you have, because if I go model an HF release to water and it models 12 miles down a ditch, that's a whole different response than scooping up oil.
sure, I mean, it's not going to be the same as your oil response plan. But some response, a lot, I guess when I say portions of this, you have the hazard analysis for these chemicals. You should already have detailed out, like your firefighting response to a release. And yes, that will change some with water. I mean, and you bring up another good point, Barry. One of the things we mentioned is that, for oil, the Coast Guard has an oversight program that basically evaluates OSROs, our oil spill response organizations. But there is no such program for spill response organizations dealing with hazardous chemicals. These are all questions that have been put to the agency. Where do we go from here? And like I said, EPA is also working to develop a prep update as far as exercise programs and stuff like that. I mean, I attended some conferences where those things are in the works, but again, they haven't been issued yet. So yes, they are essentially putting us on a back foot, so to speak, because we still have a compliance deadline that has not been moved yet. So by that compliance date, we have to submit something. Now, as we get closer, I mean, we're going to have to work with the agencies, and that's kind of where we're at right now, unfortunately. But as soon as we get information, we intend to hand it out to our clients so that you can be prepared.
No, and I don't mean to put you guys on the spot. I just think you're obviously interacting with them. They need to understand that, you're mandating that I use a contractor for which there's no program to evaluate to see if it's good enough to put in a plan that I got to submit before the date of I mean, it's fraught with problems.
Yeah, yes,
yeah,
I agree.
Don't want to beat a dead horse, but I can't.
No, yes. And like I said, a lot of these things have been brought to EPA and the Spill Control Association is an organization that is bringing a lot of these things to pointing out exactly what you're saying. Hey, these are holes and we need guidance on what to do for compliance for these holes. I mean, when it comes to that funding lapse, the bad part is there's no funding even for them to go back and do an update to the rule. So we're really waiting and just holding and kind of in this holding pattern. So, and if you have any other concerns, feel free to forward them on. I mean, we're doing what we can to make compliance as easy as possible. Well, it's not going to be easy, obviously. This is a big undertaking, but we're working to do what we can for our clients.
No, I understand it. It's a big undertaking if all the infrastructure was in place, but it's not. So it's really tough because
Yeah, the other big difference from the oil spill response rule, or I guess what hasn't been emphasized necessarily under the excuse me, what hasn't really been emphasized under the oil rule is this new requirement for firefighting capabilities. EPA has, I guess, in some instances been burned in the past on responses where facilities were relying on local resources that did not have the capability to respond. And that's a hole they're attempting to address in this rule. And they're also pushing it a little bit on the FRP side too. And that's that larger facilities have firefighting resources outside of local emergency response. And if they do not have those on site, they want to see contracted resources in place for response to a major release that could potentially result in a fire due to impacting adjacent tanks and things like that. So,
well, I appreciate it. That's all I had. That was all my questions.
no, good questions, and I appreciate that, Barry.
Okay, so we're gonna leave the Q&A session open for a few more minutes. If anybody has a question, just feel free to drop it in the chat or raise your hand and I can unmute you. Thanks. Okay, so we're going to leave it open for another 2 minutes for any questions we have. Again, thank you to Molly and Hannah. And as a reminder, this webinar will be recorded and we will share it on our website. If you have any questions or think of anything after the webinar, you are feel free to email marketing@providenceeng.com or reach out to Molly and Hannah.
Okay, I see where we have another question. Once completed, the total plan is to be submitted to EPA. Is this for EPA's approval or will we hear from them otherwise? The answer to that is yes, they do plan to review and approve plans. So you'll have two submittals. As an FRP facility, you'll have the substantial harm certification form and you will have the plan itself. And those are on a 5-year review and resubmittal cycle. Now, I will say their long-term plan for this is to have something set up similar to RMP Submit, and they're hoping to have eventually an electronic plan submittal. But that will be a bit down the road, I do believe. I don't think it will be up and running for the first iteration of plans.
All right, Molly and Hannah, I think we're going to stay on for another minute or two for just any last minute questions. Hey, everyone, I think that's all the questions. I just want to check one more time to make sure we've got everything. So, so thank you all for attending. We appreciate your time. Again, this will be recorded. And of course, I can send out an email with a link to the recording if you want to share it across your facility. Again, we appreciate your time and thank you to Molly and Hannah. With that, we're going to go ahead and close our webinar. And again, feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any questions or think of any questions after the fact. marketing@providenceeng.com and Molly McKean at providenceeng.com or Hannah Orgeron at providenceeng.com. Thank you, guys.